All right, so good evening. My name is Larry Fuel. I'm Director of the Global Affairs Center. Thank you very much for coming out on this damp evening. According to the Department of Homeland Security, our daily life, economic vitality, this is a quote now, and national security depend on a stable, safe, and resilient cyberspace. Cyberspace and its underlying infrastructure are vulnerable to a range of risks. Sophisticated cyber actors and nation states exploit vulnerabilities to steal information and money. And they are developing capabilities to disrupt, destroy, or threaten the delivery of essential services to individuals or to nations. All of this is on the Department of Homeland Security's website, which was itself reported to have been hacked last year. I don't know if it's true or not, but so some of the questions that we're going to be dealing with hopefully tonight, or that come to mind, are what are the key factors involved in protecting yourself against cyber attacks and cyber threats? How do we determine where cyber attacks originate? Where is this stuff coming from? In the absence of knowing the source of a cyber attack, how do we respond? And how is international cybersecurity different or not from the homegrown varieties of it? So here to help us understand this subject, to my left is Dr. Jessica Beyer of the Jackson School at the University of Washington. Dr. Beyer is a research scientist and a member of the faculty and member of the Technology and Social Change Group at the university. Her research focuses on online political mobilization and how actors such as Anonymous, that's the name of one particular group, and other hacktivists operate. She recently wrote a book on this subject called Expect Us: Online Communities and Political Mobilization. The book is available at libraries, bookstores, and yes, you can buy it online. She's very knowledgeable of the good, bad, and the ugly of cybersecurity at both the personal level, things like social activism and online banking, as well as at the nation level, things like states interfering in the political processes of other states, such as been in the news here in the United States very much recently. So we will proceed as follows. Dr. Beyer will speak for about 45 minutes. Then she will take your questions. We are recording this event for classroom use, so we ask that when you have a question, that you wave your hand, we will recognize you and bring you a microphone to ask your question. If you prefer, you can write your question on the card in your program, and we will do our best to make sure it's asked. Also, so that we get everyone's time for all the questions, we ask that we keep yours brief, and please refrain from making lengthy comments. And before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping announcements. I hope everyone's had a chance that wants to help themselves to hot beverage. We have some stuff in the back. Coffee, tea, hot chocolate, cider. Restrooms are out and around the corner if anyone needs that. Please turn off or silence your cell phones. And any students who need to have a paper signed should see me at the end of the event. But please remain seated until the red light has gone off. And now please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Beyer.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to have been invited to come talk to you tonight about cybersecurity issues, especially on the wake of the inauguration, around which there has been so much speculation and reporting about cybersecurity issues. So I have a talk prepared. I think it's less than 45 minutes. Please feel free to raise your hand. Actually, that might disrupt the process. Ask questions during. So I will not make that offer. Normally I would say, feel free to interrupt me. I'm happy to answer questions as we go. Okay, so as part of this talk, Larry asked if I would talk about 4 major themes, as he just articulated, but let me just refresh your memories. Ways to determine the origins of cyber attacks, how to respond if the source of an attack is unknown, the landscape of international cybersecurity. So I'm going to talk about those 3 things kind of all together. And then the last thing is the key factors involved in protecting ourselves against cyber attack. That's slightly different, and so I'm going to talk about that last, all right? And tonight, I'm going to answer or discuss those first 3 questions in terms of a particular type of cybersecurity challenge, and that is hackers. And I'm going to try and frame this around the recent DNC hack, so we can ground it in a current event that most people probably are familiar with. Okay, so hackers currently are dominating the news cycle more and more. We're hearing more and more news about big hacks happening. The probably biggest that we have just gotten a lot of news about is the news of the DNC hacks and the possible influence the Russians have had on the US election that has just passed. And when people talk about hackers in international affairs, they usually have this sort of hacker. This is the big scary hacker, but actually they're talking about a very diverse set of people, and it's more than one type of actor. So I'm going to start by just talking about the 6 types of sort of people using hacking as a tactic in international affairs, right? Six types of actors, all right? The first type of actor is hacktivists. This is my area of research prior to getting further into cybersecurity. So examples of hacktivists would be groups such as Anonymous, Telecomics, LulzSec, the first Guccifer, which we'll talk about in a second. And hacktivists are independent actors working to enact political and social change through the use of hacking and other related techniques. These techniques would be considered illegal by law enforcement, but are considered civil disobedience by hacktivists. And really the distinguishing feature of a hacktivist is the use of those techniques. That's what makes them different than activists, which is the second category. So activists in the sphere of technology we can consider them to be independent actors working to accomplish political or social change whose efforts are amplified by technology. And it's this use of technology that makes them distinct, but what they're pursuing really isn't something new necessarily. And in this category, you would have groups such as WikiLeaks, both WikiLeaks as it is today and WikiLeaks when it was founded. There's many activists involved who have since spread into other things. The Pirate Bay, the people who founded that worked around intellectual property issues. The Chaos Computer Club in Germany. Okay, so there's a bunch of these activists who are focused on technology things. There is, of course, overlap between hacktivists and activists. They work together. Hacktivists could be considered a sub-area of activists. So those are the first 2. The third is cyber criminals. Cyber criminals don't have overlap with hacktivists or activists, except sometimes they do help hacktivists. They're independent actors, often with close ties to organized crime, who usually are motivated by profit. Okay? And that is their defining characteristic. They are motivated by profit, and really their names, you can see them on the most wanted lists. They're people's names, right? Just ordinary people. Every once in a while you see a collective that will name themselves, like the Russian Business Network, but usually the people who are wanted for cybercrimes are just people. The fourth category are terrorists. Terrorists use hacking techniques as part of pursuing their agenda. They have almost no relationship to any of the first 3 categories. This would be ISIS, right? ISIS has been using digital technology and the internet to great effect. There's been a lot of attention paid to the ways in which they're using the internet to achieve their political aims, and those political aims are tied to a violent offline campaign. Of course, they have learned from other people. There are, for a while, were ISIS members who had been working with Anonymous before they joined ISIS, and were using some of the same techniques. The 5th category is the one that we're mostly going to be talking about tonight, and that is the category of the patriotic hacker. And these are independent actors who work on behalf of their government in an informal capacity, sometimes choosing their own targets and sometimes being directed to targets. They may or may not be financially rewarded for this. Maybe they just do it because it feels good to help their government. But they are not employees of that government, okay? The distinguishing characteristic for them is the use of hacking and other related techniques that are tied to state goals, so tied to a particular government's goals. That could be loosely tied, so that could be that you know that the Russian government doesn't like the US, and so you attack the US on behalf of the Russian government. Or in the case of a well-known American patriotic hacker, the Jester, he went after WikiLeaks repeatedly on sort of behalf of the US government, although he's an independent actor. Other examples are the Syrian Electronic Army. There's a bunch of them. And then the last category is government agency actors. So this would be people who are employees of the NSA or the Federal Security Service in Russia. And these are hackers or other technicians who are government employees who are contractually bound to pursue official national security agendas and tasks. So what makes them distinct is they get a paycheck for working on behalf of the government. So they can be considered, if an NSA hacker hacks Russia, that would be a US attack on Russia. But if a patriotic hacker who happens to be American attacks Russia, everything gets more challenging to differentiate, which is what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about here. Okay, so this ball of wax, these six different distinct groups, is hacking in international affairs, and this is both domestic. It would stretch from domestic to international and back. Okay. But the interesting thing about patriotic hackers is it creates an element of geography that I think even a few years ago we wouldn't have talked about exactly in terms of internet political action. We would have maybe talked about it in terms of internet penetration or other factors like that. But we see that sort of allegiance to the nation state becoming an interesting distinguishing factor. Okay, so as we all know, towards the end or middle of the last presidential campaign, the DNC was hacked, and the acquired cache of emails and other information was handed over to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks made them public. The US government claimed that the Russian government was responsible for that, but the Russian government, of course, said that they were not responsible for that. Meanwhile, a hacker named Guccifer 2.0 claimed responsibility. However, experts, and apparently also the US government, were not convinced that Guccifer 2.0 was a politically motivated hacker operating on his own. And everyone has now said that he's a cover either for Russian government employees or for patriotic hackers working on behalf of the Russian government. Okay, so as this case illustrates, a central cybersecurity challenge today is the question of attribution. Basically the question of how do we know who is responsible for a cyber attack? And this really gets at two of those bullet points that I was asked to discuss tonight: ways to determine the origin of cyber attack and how to respond when the source of an attack is unknown. Okay, so in the DNC case, attribution was difficult because in spite of data left behind that people were able to put together, and this, of course, and I'm sure lots of other intelligence led to the US government being very convinced that the Russians were behind it. The culprits worked very hard to hide their nationality. So experts have pointed out that if you dug into the available data around the hacks and looked at it in comparison to other Russia-related hacks, it looked like there were more than one actor at work in the DNC hack. So in spite of one person saying that he was responsible, it looked to be there were people who were doing the hacking, there were people who were using the data that was acquired, there were people claiming that they took it for political reasons, there was also WikiLeaks out there distributing the information. So many actors around one incident doing different things. Guccifer 2.0, who is the individual who claimed responsibility for the attack, made every effort to look like a hacktivist operating with his own political agenda. Okay, so and unaffiliated with any nation state. So like Anonymous, he released mocking statements via Twitter and his website. Like other hacktivists, including Anonymous, he wrote seemingly political motivated statements saying that he had done what he had done in the hopes that he would overthrow the political elite. He claimed to be Eastern European and not Russian, and he followed the same pathways for publicity that hacktivists often use when revealing a major politically motivated hack. Sean Gallagher at Ars Technica, who writes on these issues a lot, called him a fake-tivist, okay, because it was clear that it probably wasn't this one guy, but he was trying really hard to look like it was him, and he was using all of these hacktivist tropes, symbolism, and behavior models to hide his affiliation with the Russian government, and this wasn't random. Even his choice of name referenced a Guccifer, the first Guccifer, who was a politically motivated hacker who wasn't affiliated with any government, a guy named Marcel Lazare. And Guccifer 2.0 lists him as a personal hero on his website. Okay? In masking his actions in this way, if we assume that he is actually a single individual, which we maybe can't, Guccifer 2.0 created plausible deniability for the Russian government, making attribution of the attack difficult. As Putin's spokesperson said when the US government came out and said this was a Russian attack, he said, every day Putin's website gets attacked by several tens of thousands of hackers. A lot of these attacks are traced to the territory of the USA, but we do not blame the White House or Langley each time. Okay? So Guccifer 2.0 exemplifies this tool that hacking represents for governments now in international relations. The use of hackers, particularly contracted cyber criminals or patriotic hackers to do the work of a government, brings benefits with low costs. And governments all over use hackers as a tool. So for example, researchers recently discovered that they traced a group of hackers. They apparently were working out of one of the country's military academies. The government said that they weren't affiliated with them, but they were there working, and they were working during normal business hours. So they were clocking in and clocking out, making it look as if they were government employees. Also, North Korean hackers often work from China because China has better infrastructure than North Korea. They're certainly being paid by North Korea, but their existence outside of the territory of North Korea gives the North Korean government deniability should they choose to use it, which they probably wouldn't. And it also gives China deniability as well, because they can say that they don't know that they're there and what they're doing. Okay? And in many cases, what's important actually is plausible deniability, not actual hard deniability. So the US government says it's Russia. Russia says, no, it wasn't. And there's some space there where that can be debated. In an even more complicated incident in 2013, Russia issued an international travel advisory to Russian hackers in general, including those who would be considered cyber criminals. So these would be people who had engaged in just like credit card theft, crime as we would define it, and would be defined as crime in Russia. The warning was issued because the US government was then, and actually still is, working with other countries to extradite hackers when they appear in those countries, like if they go on vacation or something. And then they're brought back to the US to face trial. In this case, the Russian government was trying to protect all non-governmental hackers and sort of this blanket warning, even ones that you would think that the Russian government would also define as criminal. Okay, so this type of actor is one that many countries draw on as a useful tool. And this is in part because it is difficult because of that attribution challenge, okay? So attribution is central to whether countries can reasonably and publicly escalate tensions and retaliate after a cyber attack. So as we know now, the Obama administration has been willing to say publicly, after a little while, it took them a while to do this, that it was Russia, and to engage in some form of punishment for that action or retaliation. So in December, Obama threw 35 suspected intelligence officials or people, operatives, out of the US. They placed sanctions on 2 Russian intelligence agencies, a handful of intelligence officials, and some other things. But notice that in spite of this attack being arguably on something of essential importance to the United States, a presidential election, the Obama administration did not choose to pursue any more confrontational tactics, like the use of actual weapons. And this is one of the issues in cyber war, right? At what point do we decide that we're sure enough that we attack back in the open? Okay, so that reluctance to escalate, this sort of natural conservativeness of governments around war, which we all probably are grateful for, makes hacking and the use of any sort of cyber tactics powerful tools. Even though kinetic warfare or physical warfare is always a possibility, the attribution difficulties combined with this conservatism about taking physical action and response pushes conflict into the shadows. And the DNC hacks made a big splash because, of course, it was an attack on a major player in a presidential election, but it is an example of a strategy that can be used that produces benefit to countries. Okay, so therefore we can think hackers provide governments with a tool to pursue strategies with less danger than other types of strategy. So probably retribution will not be swift or super violent, okay? This action occurs in a space where there are also limited international norms and agreements defining behavior around the use of cyber tactics between countries. Okay, so even as countries continue to make state-to-state agreements, as the US and China did in 2015, where they agreed that neither government would engage in commercial hacking of the other, and I want to stress the commercial. So what they agreed to was that neither government would engage in hacking of trade secrets or intellectual property. The difficulty of attribution makes it unlikely that hacking is going to stop. So, and there's like a big debate going on whether that agreement has actually led to a very significant drop in the amount of commercial hacking that has been going on between the US and China. Okay, so because it's new, there is just not a lot of standards of behavior developed. And there's debates about whether we should use other guidelines for behavior and have them apply to cyberspace or not. But tied to that there's fundamental barriers to creating shared norms around the internet internationally. Okay, so the 2015 agreement between the US and China, in that agreement, the US and China agreed to work together to identify and promote good norms for behavior around cyberspace, although they did not determine what that meant. There was also an agreement to try and create mechanisms to de-escalate conflict between the US and China, and that has been going very slowly as well. Like, what does that mean? How do people communicate if they want to talk about something that's happening? And that's not uncommon for any international agreement around cyberspace, because there's fundamental barriers internationally to making agreements that have to do with the internet between countries. And really that barrier comes down to how countries view information and what they think the internet should be like. Okay, so countries that see information as not being inherently dangerous, who believe that the internet should look like it does mostly today. It's owned by many people. It was built by stakeholders in academia and industry and government. Information flows freely, more or less. There's some debate around that, but generally it flows freely. Countries that want the internet to look like that are in one camp, and countries that want to exercise more sovereignty over the internet itself in their countries are in another camp. So the US would be an example of a country in the first camp, and is really the leader of people arguing that any agreements we make internationally around the internet and internet governance should have that structure of the internet and those values in mind. And in fact, you see that same type of argument. So if you look at regulation around terrorist use of the internet, countries that have some protection for freedom of speech, sort of inherent to the country, whether it's legal or cultural or customary, tend to put that into the regulations that guide how they're going to go after terrorist use of the internet, whereas countries that don't tend to define any challenge to the state as being extremist action or terrorist actions. Okay, so countries such as China and Russia want what they would call internet sovereignty. They want state-level control of the internet, and they want to create agreements between countries, so bilateral agreements. And so that disagreement becomes this barrier to any agreement internationally, because those issues creep into pretty much everything. So you can see that those camps have been for quite some time now factioning out internationally, and China and Russia have a cybersecurity agreement that has a lot of stuff in it, but many people think it's actually a sort of place for them to have an agreement that they can then use up that partnership to push forward internationally for internet sovereignty and challenge the US's, what has really been the US's dominance of internet governance up until now, okay? All right, so the debate over international norms tied to this ease with which countries can use hacking to pursue goals increases the probability that we are going to just continue to see these types of hacks, and that it could get more serious, all right? So And this raises a question for all of us that in some ways harkens back to the question about nuclear weapons. And that is does the potential disaster create stability because people understand that, say, a nuclear war would kill us all, right? We now know it would kill us all. Even a small one would cause nuclear winter. So is that danger enough to create stability and keep people from using really terrible attacks? For instance, things that are hypothesized is you can cause things to spin really fast and make dams break. I mean, there's all kinds of terrible disaster scenes you can imagine. Or is it going to create offense or instability, and we'll see countries instead going through sort of an arms race trying to create sophisticated offensive capabilities and use these capabilities to wage war sort of just below the things being out in the open. Okay, so that would be the major landscape that I would describe. So now let me talk about how this very challenging question of how do we protect ourselves from cyber attacks. So things such as the DNC hack should not come as a surprise. There are so many actors out there. There's not just, of course, governments, but also all of the cyber criminals who make a lot of money off of hacking things. Motives, targets, cyber attacks are inevitable. They're an inevitable part of our life. And the challenge in identifying who is behind things and attributing them only makes this picture more complicated. And I will say that if you look at the pie charts of number of cyber attacks, right, it's like 85% is just regular crime, right? So our bank information or whatever. Okay, so I have four things that we can do to protect ourselves. Okay, so the first thing we can do is to focus on resilience. People used to think that we might be able to protect ourselves absolutely from cyber attack, but we know that's not true. So often the metaphor that's used is the idea of a moat and a castle model. That is not going to work. Instead, we need to focus on mitigating damage and emerging with stronger security after attacks. So learning from attacks and doing better next time. I would say that it's important not to let a disaster happen to make this matter to us. So a colleague I know who works in aviation says that airline security is what it is now because of 9/11. He thinks, he works in cybersecurity and aviation. He thinks that something like that will happen in the realm of cybersecurity and that people will start paying more attention. We don't want that, right? We don't want that sort of huge tragedy to be the impetus for making our systems more secure. Instead, we should be focusing on that now. So we should modernize our equipment. We should look to make sure that our supply chains are secure. So the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management hack, the equipment there was very old. The supply chains, there was this huge attack that was because of just insecure devices. We want to make sure that the cost of security is factored into any cost of production. Okay, so if we look at the Office of Personnel Management hack in 2014, again, the equipment was outdated. They hadn't fully staffed themselves with people who had the expertise to protect them. And a ton of information was stolen that was both sensitive to individuals, but also, if you dig through it, could have national security implications as well. In another example, in 2015, FireEye obtained information that a hacking group called APT30 had been attacking critical information infrastructure in Southeast Asia for nearly a decade undetected. They were gathering information about regional, political, economic, and military matters. And most people think it was APT30 was a Chinese group that was gathering information and doing surveillance, perhaps related to the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Both that incident and the Office of Personnel incident, the Office of Personnel incident went on for over a year without being discovered. So both of these are cases in which there wasn't just sort of baseline security in place already. So that's the first thing, resilience. We need to build resilience. And we're seeing that, right? The Obama administration made that a priority. And we'll see cybersecurity seems to be maybe important to the incoming administration, and hopefully that effort will continue. The second thing I would argue is to create international norms around and agreements around the use of hacking as a tactic. And this is starting to happen now with these bilateral agreements. I'm actually not optimistic that any agreement will actually stop it from happening, but transparent and agreed upon rules also create transparent and agreed upon responses to breaches. So it will help push that into the light a little bit. And international relations scholars have found that countries are reluctant to violate international norms, at least in the open. So, and there is if you're an optimist, a good track record internationally with coming to international agreements surrounding dangerous things like nuclear weapons, biological weapons. Computers are a little more complicated because anyone can go buy one, right? But we have been able to further agreements around dangerous weaponry before. There is a lot of international cooperation that is going on already, and more of that is good. So we see National Computer Emergency Response Teams, the CERTs, help each other. We see international organizations working to coordinate action. NATO does a lot of work. The European Union does a lot of work. So this sort of international effort, much like things like the environment, the Arctic, these are the outer space, these are international problems that need cooperation between countries to solve. We aren't actually going to be able to solve cybersecurity as an issue just in the United States. The third thing is work to improve information sharing. This is a really complicated one. So it's like interesting to write it down and then think, I actually don't know how you would actually do that. Okay, so information sharing needs to be improved between organizations, within organizations, between organizations in the government, and between governments. So cybersecurity attacks of any kind flourish in environments where there's imperfect information sharing, and that basically describes every environment, right? We have a lot of mechanisms now for sharing information. We have information sharing and analysis centers. These are sector-specific information sharing organizations. The DHS has a bunch of ways that they foster information sharing. But there are still a lot of barriers to sharing information, particularly between the countries that manage the data that is both the data that is very valuable and also the infrastructure that is all online now. So people are afraid that they will lose reputation. So I've heard someone say, I'm sitting in a meeting with a bunch of people from other companies, and if I say our system has been hacked, then I might see that show up in one of their advertisements a week later. There's also intellectual property issues, so you have to share what has been hacked, and in that way you might be revealing intellectual property to competitors. So trust is a huge issue, and one of the ways this has been addressed is there are a lot of informal groups. In Seattle, there's a bunch of them where people get together and sort of form personal relationships, and then hopefully those personal relationships foster feeling free to say, like, hey, we have a problem, and you guys are using the same technology, so you might have a problem too. At the international level, we also have some cooperative bodies with other countries, things like the Trilateral Cyber Experts Group with Mexico and Canada. This isn't unusual. We have one with Australia. I believe we have one with Japan. And most think that they're good and there should be more. So one of the things I do in the Jackson School is I supervise a group of students who are doing research into cybersecurity issues around the world. And they just we're right now publishing on our website a series on advice on cybersecurity relations between the US and other countries. And one of the most common recommendations that have been coming up is expand, invest in these information sharing groups that exist. However, one of the most difficult information sharing challenges is actually within organizations. So again, the office, not to pick on the Office of Personnel Management, but it occurred, they think, in 2014, but went unnoticed until 2015. In that case, it was an external company that discovered the breach. And in a congressional hearing around that, an engineer who worked for OPM said that he had found it 5 days before that company, and he had reported it, but that they had brought the external company in to see if they would find it too. People kind of scoffed at this, like, why would you wait basically a week to fix this huge problem? And the president of the company that was brought in said it didn't seem like anyone was aware that it was going on when they got there. So either there's some half-truths being told or someone is a really good actor. But this story illustrates that one of the really hard things about cybersecurity is that it comes down to just ordinary people doing their jobs and workplaces. So informal work practices and trust can actually have very big repercussions. People might notice something funny. They might have reasons they don't report it. Maybe their boss isn't nice, or they are sick of their job, or they're afraid they'll get in trouble if they report it. Okay, so the issue of information sharing is a really big one, and really a lot of it comes down to trust. But some sharing is better than none, right? Okay. All right, so the last thing I would argue that we can do is education, and I would split that into two categories. The first category is the education of future cybersecurity professionals. And I don't know if you all read cybersecurity news religiously. I'm just going to assume you do. You probably have seen the many articles about how we have this crisis in the cybersecurity profession. It's 1 million people short. There's going to be so many jobs and there's no one to fill it. All of those news stories are based on studies of industry, but they almost never ask, like, what are the jobs that need to be filled? Certainly, we can assume that many of them require computer science skills, but if you look at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they put out lists of cybersecurity type job categories, and at least 20% have very little to do with technology other than people needing a conversant knowledge of it. They have to do with things like who has jurisdiction over things if there's a big crisis. How do you manage people? How do you educate people? What happens if you make a decision in the United States around encryption with your allies? Okay, so, and of course, coming from the Jackson School and talking here, it's the global one that I would make a big pitch for students to really think about as an area of interest. But there is a big opening happening, and there is a need for a lot of diverse knowledge sets to plug into that. So that's the first part of the education. The second part is the more challenging part, and that is what I sort of mentioned in the information sharing section, and that is people are the #1 cybersecurity risk to the United States, like individual people like you and me. We are the single biggest problem for cybersecurity, both here and everywhere in the world. We plug things in that we shouldn't. We click on things that we shouldn't. We tell people our passwords. We tell people our mother's maiden names, and then that allows them to get into things. We are just terrible for cybersecurity. And so there needs to be a more holistic education to help people understand what is safe and what isn't safe to do. And it will need to evolve as well because tactics evolve. So right now there's a big phishing campaign going on. I don't know if you guys know this. We've been getting warnings from the University of Washington that things are getting more and more sophisticated. Don't open any files or click on any links from unfamiliar email. Okay? All right, so on that level as well, we need to improve education in organizations, but we also need to improve education of just average people. And if you think about like public service stuff, that's a really hard thing to do, and it's also hard to do if you're going to have to make it evolve with evolving tactics, okay? Because people are sort of, we don't pay attention, and we're also sort of systematically optimistic, right? We don't think that this is the moment in which we are going to click on the wrong thing and cause the entire DNC to be hacked, okay? All right, so that's it. Do you guys have any questions for me? Yes. I don't remember the system. Yeah, I'm going to let you.
So, thank you very, very much for sharing your ideas with us.
Yeah.
Appreciate that very much. And so again, what we're going to do now, there's a couple people roaming around with microphones. If you have questions, just sort of raise your hand, indicate you have a question, and somebody will come running up to you to like Alexis has a question, and take it away.
Oh, am I first then?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. I was hoping you could speak to information sharing as we move to the cloud and how that is a challenge or not a challenge. I just foresee that being more of a challenge than like on-premises data and sharing within a company.
Yeah, I think that the essential challenges don't change, right? So there is the challenge if you encrypt the data and the company itself can't necessarily access it, then you can't share it. And that's something you see companies doing, particularly in response to Snowden's revelations about what the United States was surveilling. I know that people I work with at Microsoft say, like, we can't access what's in the cloud, it's encrypted. So that will frustrate information sharing, but discovering vulnerabilities. So I guess if like terrorists are storing tactics there or tactics in some place that's encrypted, then we're kind of out of luck, right? Unless we want to build backdoors into that information. In terms of like someone has breached your system in some way, to me, the fundamental challenges are like people don't trust each other, companies don't trust each other, they don't trust the government. One of the things I do is I work with a working group of it has a bunch of people from industry in it, and they are like, they don't necessarily trust the government, and in some ways you think, why would you, after some things like the OPM hack? So those like basic trust issues are so big that it creates big barriers to people sharing if something's going on. And of course, if someone else is vulnerable to the same thing and they don't know that it could happen to them, then it can spread.
Carolyn, you have a question back here?
How effective are our methods of tracing back people who piggyback off of other servers?
I can't answer that question. So the people who do the forensics on this are quite good at it, but there's still always ways to spoof location. So, and again, it's not that they're wrong. Like, it's more that is there doubt that's like introduced there that then the Russian government can say, or the North Korean government, or the Chinese government can say, it wasn't us, right? So, there's huge debates about Guccifer 2.0, about whether, there was in the, like, stuff that was left behind, there's like Cyrillic characters. Was that enough to be able to say for sure that it was Russian? If you match that attack against others that had happened, where people were pretty sure it was Russian hackers, it looked the same, they were using the same tactics, same code. People are very effective, and I would assume that our intelligence agencies have tools that the average person doesn't have, or the average journalist. But there's always going to be that little space that can be exploited by a government not wanting to claim responsibility, or, I think in the case of the Russians, kind of wanting to have people think it was them without having to, but also say it wasn't them. So that doubt that's introduced is also an effective tactic because it undermines our trust in our institutions.
Speaking of trust,
Yeah.
some of our whistleblowers have had a very hard time sharing issues they felt the public had a right to know, and the government turning right around and going after them. So how do we deal with that?
That is a very interesting and challenging question. The question of whistleblowers, so I think most people agree that whistleblowers can be a good thing. We have many whistleblowers who we hold in esteem, who've revealed corporate excesses and other bad things. I think once we get into the area of revealing stuff about national security, then we start to have this back and forth, this question between what is more like the rights versus security dilemma. And I think as long as that debate is occurring, we're not going to be able to see clear policy around, should Edward Snowden be considered a criminal or a hero, is going to come down to what you or I think about what he revealed, and also about just transparency in general. So, but I don't know. That's a really hard question, especially this week.
You said that we needed better security on our computers. Are you talking about hardware or software?
Both. Yes. Both. We need you. So to make sure a device is safe, you will need to make sure the whole supply chain is safe. So the building of the device, and then the software that's installed on the device as well.
So for personal security, what would we need to do?
You would want to buy devices that you knew were safe as much as we can. So some companies take a lot of care in their supply line. So like Microsoft has policies around that. But it's kind of, we're sort of in a regulatory weird place here where we're kind of before there's a problem, but we aren't fully protected from that problem yet. So how do we regulate that? So, if you have like the security cameras that are notoriously insecure at your house, one of the big companies there is building in China. They're doing that for lower costs. They found out they had a huge vulnerability, and one of their reasons was they just were saving money. They just, they're operating on a sort of bare budget, and, sorry, kind of. Just do research and, watch, because as people find things and reveal them, often there are fixes for them. But yeah, it's a hard question, and it can make you really paranoid very fast.
Should the government U.S. hire cyber criminals as patriotic hackers, like, for example, the governments of China does?
Well, nobody admits to doing that. I don't think so. I think that's probably a bad idea. The U.S. government ignores patriotic hackers that are here, so as long as they don't do anything that is sort of in conflict with U.S. law, they let them be. So an example is the Jester. He went after WikiLeaks a bunch. The U.S. government presumably might be able to find him. They don't try. But I think probably what would be best for everyone is to have things be transparent and not operate in that gray area where what is allowed and not allowed is undefined. So that said, that's a very optimistic thing to say, and I think it's unlikely that that will occur. And also, we don't know, right? So we see Obama has kicked a bunch of people out of the country and has brought sanctions against various agents in Russia, but what is the NSA doing in response to that? We actually have no idea. So, and I have heard, I don't know if this is true, the NSA has the best hackers in the world working for them.
Other questions?
I don't know how you'd measure that, like who's the best.
Jonathan, there's a question right here.
Given that everything seems to be hackable, why do people like the government rely on emails? Wouldn't it be easier sometimes to pick up the phone and just call somebody, or get a typewriter and send like a classified document like we used to? I mean, it's like it's all out and.
Yes, that's a very good question. Email doesn't have to be really insecure. It could be more secure. The internet wasn't built for the world that we live in now, so the protocols that we use, where everything is kind of open, don't necessarily match any world actually, because the world's always full of humans who are looking for an opportunity. I have heard a rumor, that I don't know if it's true, that in Russia, the KGB, they've started bringing typewriters back, because it's harder to break into a building and take something out of a file cabinet than it is to hack in. So that's a good question. If we're going to see, there was that, this is a story from my childhood, that in the 80s, one of the brand new Soviet fighter jets, the pilot defected to Japan and landed, and when they opened it up expecting to see the best new technology, they found vacuum tubes and really old technology, and everyone was laughing, the Soviets, until they realized that in a nuclear war, all the electronics, of course, go dead, and that plane would still have been flying when the U.S. Planes wouldn't. So there's something to be said for old tech.
Who watches the watchers? How do we trust what our own government says? And How does the, yeah, that's it.
I have that same question all the time, and even more since Snowden. Yeah. Yeah, that's I think a very good question, particularly as there's that joke that Facebook is actually a CIA plot, right? Because we put why they don't even need spies anymore, they can just friend us on Facebook. Yeah.
Other questions? I'm going to ask a question. I don't have a microphone, so you might have to repeat it, but basically it's a follow-up to the very first question, having to do with iCloud. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Is that a unique platform, the iCloud, and the cloud, rather?
Yeah.
Not the iCloud, but the cloud. And
Apple might call it that.
yeah. And so what unique, if any, challenges of security does it require?
Sure, I can try.
Present?
I don't know that I have the expertise to answer it. I can say that, so the cloud is, instead of information being stored on the device we have, it's stored somewhere else. Okay?
How's the cloud different from a server than a hard server in the building?
It's different in that, like, in the past, for example, you would take pictures on your phone, and all of those files would exist on your phone, and if you wanted to put it on another device, you would need to connect your phone with a cord and whatever. And now, so I don't know if you have an iPhone, my photos are all synced to the cloud, and they're stored elsewhere, on servers somewhere else.
So that's the only distinction between a server.
Yeah, so I think what companies like Microsoft and probably Amazon would see in the future is, like, we would have a terminal that almost like the original computers, we'd have a terminal we would type on, and everything would be stored somewhere else in the cloud. So there are, like, a whole host of things that are created because of that. It's messy, right? So if all of our stuff is on our computer, then we're responsible for the security there to some extent. Although, like Microsoft releases patches every Tuesday or whatever. If it exists elsewhere, like on the Azure, whatever Microsoft's cloud project is, then Microsoft has all that data, and they're managing that data, and they're protecting that data. The conversation I've heard the most about the cloud and security is less about security from hacking and more about the issues of privacy and corporations. So who owns what our data if we don't have it, if it exists elsewhere? Who has the right to look at it? So it's those types of questions, the same types of questions that are raised by, say, Facebook. At least that's the conversation I've heard around issues around the cloud. Anyway, and then there's, like, from a security law enforcement perspective, like Microsoft, they encrypt what they have on the cloud. That means that it's not easy to access. So there's other issues as well. But yeah, that would be as much as I could speak to, probably.
Any other questions out here?
So you said the ability to erase your tracks, so to speak, it's doable. So is this a really big deal piece of software or hardware, or is this something that anybody can get their hands on for their home computer or iPad or whatever?
Oh, like to make yourself invisible?
Confuse your
I don't
IP
know
code or whatever?
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, that's what you're saying that they are able to do.
So if you're someone who's engaged, who's been hacking, you can take measures to disguise who you are. Yeah, you can use some of those same tools for sure. You can encrypt all your communication. You can use things like the Tor browser, which is less secure than we thought it was. But some of that stuff is people trying to break into something and while also keeping themselves hidden from other people. So for, like, the ordinary person who's not trying to do anything sort of nefarious, I don't know that you would need the same tools. If you're, like, wanting to be invisible from the all-seeing eye of...
I'm not talking about the average person who's not
Yeah.
trying to do anything nefarious.
You're talking about, yeah. Yeah, that would be about someone who's skilled in that. That said, I don't, again, so I do the policy stuff, not the technical stuff. But I have, I have a student who's an active Army officer. He studies cybersecurity. And he, like anything having to do with North Korea, he'll be like, oh yeah, they did it. And I'm like, how do you know? And he's like, I can't tell you. So, there's people leave behind information even when they try and hide it often. And I think sometimes people look to match patterns of behavior as well. So maybe someone's trying to mask what they're doing, but they look to other similar incidents, and then you can say, yeah.
So does this qualify us for, this seminar qualify us for applying for a job with Giuliani's team?
That's right. He did say he was going to try and get a lot of smart people together in a room, so here we are. We can solve all the problems, yeah.
Another question up here?
So in Europe, you can have the right to be forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
How do you erase a digital footprint like that? And how are they doing that successfully?
In Europe, the way, if you want to erase data, you like send a request into Google and they take it away. So right now, Google does that in the US for copyright stuff, or for dangerous content or whatever. In Europe, they just have another category which is under the right to be forgotten. And so you just petition, you say there's a website that says I'm a criminal and I'm not a criminal, and then they will delete that from everything. So we could, it's just the law. We could do that here too. Companies don't want that, but it is possible.
Don't take this wrong. I'm not speaking from a religious perspective, but none shall buy or sell without the number of the beast. I can see where our cell phones are getting to be our link to the world.
Yeah.
And it could get to the point where that is our link to the government and from the government in some fashion, filing taxes, rebates, whatever. And if we don't buy into that program, we wouldn't be offered the same protections that people who choose not to be a party to it would.
Right.
So at some stage, it gets to be a government foot in our door. It almost is now if they want access to our phone logs and so forth. So rather than each one of us having to have security numbers, codes, equipment, and so forth, if the government could offer or profess to offer cybersecurity so that we couldn't be hacked, there's lots of links to that.
I think businesses would be very reluctant. So to have government interfering in their products in that way, to be the agent. So that is so if you look at the problem, right, we have a problem, it's a security problem. We have an actor with a lot of means, in theory, a lot of expertise, and that is the government. It could be an impartial third party that could, so this is a proposal often around information sharing. Companies could give government information and government could share that information. Companies don't want to do that. They don't trust the government. And it's that sort of like, it's that line, right? So, it is being protected is something that we tend to look to the state to provide. But there's also, in this sort of dichotomy that we often have are privacy and security, especially now. How much privacy do we want to give up for security? If we let law enforcement look at everything we do all the time, in theory, we might have perfect security, but we also might get in trouble for things that aren't crimes, or it depends on how much you trust the government, and those tensions that are inherent, between that you spend a lot of time thinking about in political science between, what the government should do and is responsible for, and how much you can trust the government and have to rein in their powers. That conversation and the rules around that are still a pre-digital set of rules, right? So now, if you're law enforcement, you can get into one of our phones, you can see all kinds of things outside of the one thing you're looking for. And people would debate whether that's good or bad. So, yeah, it's a bold new world we're in, where in some ways our rules haven't caught up with the technology itself. So we're applying old rules to a new situation that we didn't, our closest comparisons are like the telegraph, the telephone, the television, sort of ubiquitous, like devices everywhere listening to us all the time is a really new reality. Or that we just carry in our pockets willingly with our GPS on, tracking everywhere we go, right? I would say I think a lot of activists would argue that we should be worried about the companies too, that we should worry about everybody, basically. So, yeah.
So there are some people who said that the World War III will be a cyber war, but could you explain more what exactly is a cyber war and how exactly does the nations attack each other?
Yeah, so people would be afraid of a bunch of different things. So if you attack critical infrastructure, you can cause physical damage. So you can cause, like the US allegedly helped develop a very sophisticated offensive cyber weapon called Stuxnet that went into the Iranian nuclear facilities and caused things to spin too fast, and it destroyed it. Centrifuges, there we go. Centrifuges. So there's that type of attack. Sort of scary scenarios is that you could do that on critical infrastructure like nuclear power plants, dams. There's all kinds of places where if you destroy that thing, it can cause loss of life. There's also sort of softer impacts. If you get rid of electricity for a long period of time, it has economic impact. Probably people aren't going to start rioting in the streets, but in 2011 in Egypt, when the Egyptian government shut off the internet, just the internet, there was a pretty huge economic impact. It was for like 4 days. It wasn't that long for that action. So if you kept the power off for a really long time, that could have impacts. Also, that type of attack, I think people are also very afraid of the combination of cyber attack with sort of traditional attack. So when Russia went into Georgia in 2007, 2008, every town that they went into before the troops showed up, every website in the town went offline, the electricity went out. So and people think that perhaps that's what's happening in the Ukraine, is all the attacks on the electrical grid are just getting ready for some type of attack like that.
Air traffic control.
Yeah, there's all kinds of terrible, terrible things. Stoplights that could happen related to so where you could cause quite a bit of disruption. Even just if, let's say you caused a lot of death and then people just stopped leaving their houses, that would be pretty problematic. But I think people are worried about that intersection between actual war and cyber war as well. So, because it's a fairly scary prospect. But there is a way to solve that, and that is if you just blow up a nuclear weapon in the stratosphere, take out all our electronics, and then it would rule out the cyber war issue, and probably a lot of human existence too. So, yeah.
But she's not advocating that, are
No, no, not at all.
Here comes the microphone behind you.
You mentioned supply chain concerns, and I was wondering, is there anybody or any organization certifies devices as being free of small bits of code that could essentially be security problems?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I know that Microsoft has like a paper out about how the lengths they go to protect the supply chain. If you email me, I could send you a link. But I don't know to answer that question.
So is Anonymous still, I know they went after them, you know, and they arrested a lot of people. So are they still an effective organization? Or
Yeah,
is this
they're-
just like a fog cloud, you know, a mystical thing out there now?
Yeah. So Anonymous is a hacktivist group that came out of a bulletin board system or a set of bulletin board systems around 2008, early 2008. And they have engaged in a bunch of actions, often around freedom of information causes. In their early days, their first target was the Church of Scientology. After that, they moved on to other things. So they've mobilized on behalf of WikiLeaks in 2010. That was the first really big one that hit the news. And what that was a distributed denial of service attack on a bunch of corporation websites. This is where a website just receives so many requests that it crashes. So there were quite a few people, like thousands of people involved in that, although now we know that the reason that it worked was actually cyber criminals who volunteered their botnets to help bring websites down. After that, they arrested 14 people. They arrested some other people, but there was like the PayPal 14. Most of them got off with fairly light sentences considering what usually happens to people who are involved in those types of actions. And after that, since then, Anonymous has done stuff, but it hasn't been that same sort of wide-scale stuff. It's smaller groups working, usually smaller groups with more sophisticated skills. So in 2010, it was kind of like anybody who wanted to be a part of that. Now it's more you kind of need to know what you're doing. There's like a bunch of small groups that all use the name Anonymous. And one of the things that they're particularly effective at now is they sort of use their media, the attention on them to amplify causes. Internationally, Anonymous looks different in other countries. So it's spread. You see the V for Vendetta mask at protests all over. It's become sort of the symbol of protest. But Anonymous itself looks different in different places. It just kind of also depends now what country you're talking about too. But they still exist. So yeah, they're just, I think, smaller and different than they were. So.
Questions? No, I can take it up for you. No, I can pass it back to you. Okay. Earlier you talked about ways that we can help protect ourselves, and one of the things you mentioned was education. Mm-hmm. And I give you one example of it, and tell me, give me your opinion. You go to websites and you can leave your credit card. For example, with Amazon, I leave a credit card and it's really fast. Order a book and it takes like 30 seconds. Is that a good idea?
Amazon is fairly secure.
So it's a good idea if it's Amazon, but not a good idea if it's...
You should look and make sure you're on it.
Costco?
It has a little padlock at the top. So Costco is probably secure too.
I just made that up.
Yeah. You just want to be aware, make sure that there should be visual indication that it's secure. So that, like even 5 years ago, you needed to really check. Right now, there's more of a standard, and that might happen. As things develop more, there'll be more standards, sort of commonly adhered to practices. Yeah.
So do you think it would be possible for me to hire some people to break back into the old college and change my GPA and stuff?
I'm not going to answer that, but my guess is if you go on the dark web, you might be able to. Are there any other? Simon,
I think you should something more positive.
Yeah, I'll try. Yeah, GPA is that. So do you have any insights into what Donald Trump's team plans to do with cybersecurity, any policy positions that they might take, and how Rudy Giuliani is going to affect our cybersecurity policy nationally?
That's a good question. My team of student researchers have been debating now for 3 months or 2 months. He's been very, as with many things, very scarce on details. So, to be honest, it was interesting that in the debates that there was a cybersecurity question. It was like a sign of a new world. His answers in the debates were strange and not specific. He talked about his son knowing about computers, his 13-year-old son. So his statements on cybersecurity, like a lot of things, are just, it's hard to read anything into it. His sort of ongoing argument against that Russia was involved in the election, and his refusal to listen to the intelligence community is also sort of odd, and will be interesting to see how that conflict plays out, since big attacks the intelligence community would be part of understanding what was happening and telling his administration that they were happening before the public knows. As for him, I don't know. Giuliani does have some experience in cybersecurity, maybe. So he has a consulting firm. It's hard to get a handle on whether people thought it was any good. I don't know. He has had it for 10 years, though. So that's a long time. If they are any good, they would have been paying attention to a lot of things and would have learned over time. What he said in the one interview, he actually hasn't really proposed anything that is different than what the Obama administration has been doing. And that's been a question, is what the Obama administration has been doing going to be pursued? One of the things that the Obama administration has been doing is getting a lot of smart people in the room and trying to talk things out. So holding meetings of industry people, with government people, trying to have people who are in charge of those issues. So we could actually see something of a continuation of what we've seen. Some of the stuff that Obama's administration had proposed is kind of like a no-duh thing. Like, let's modernize our equipment, for instance, right? Republican administrations sometimes are more hawkish. Cybersecurity is a big emerging issue, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But it's like anything, and the people I've work with who work in that field are all like, we have no idea. They are like, we knew who we were going to be talking to if Clinton had won. Now we don't know. So, but yeah, we'll see.
Last question right here.
One of the things that concerns me is medical information privacy. At work, we use the EPIC program, and it's shared with several hospitals locally. And it also has a button that says Care Everywhere, where you can actually import things even from hospitals that are not on EPIC. And I just wondered if you could address that, because the computers we use, like at Swedish Medical Center, are ancient.
Yeah.
They have not been updated.
I don't know. Medical information is a big concern. One of the major privacy rules we exist under is HIPAA, or at universities is FERPA. So the information, there are requirements on the creators of that software to comply with federal privacy law. So I don't know. But, again, like individuals, so your computer, there are all different ways people can get into things. And if like your IT people are good, you're probably somewhat safe. If no one is checking your computers or anything, then that would be a different matter. But medical data is a type of data that there is a lot of rules around. Unlike, so is financial data is like that too. Unlike, say, data that we give to Facebook, there's less regulation around.
I know there's been some hospitals hacked, though.
Yeah.
Not here.
Yeah. Hospitals and insurance companies, that sort of that industry tends to be more in favor of more government intervention tech companies like, Facebook or Microsoft tend to be for less government intervention in terms of cybersecurity. But that's probably why.
Okay, I think we're going to, am I working now? Stop there. Please join me in giving Dr. Beyer another round of applause.